Hello and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and today I want to examine a question that some viewers have asked about Ashiya, who is in English Isaiah. Is he a Muslim prophet or isn't he? First off, we want to check through the Quran and the Hadiths so we can look for him, but there's no mention of Isaiah anywhere. It's an interesting question. Most Muslims today know little about him. The Quran mentions Ishmael and Elisha and even Ezekiel, but it does not mention Ashiya, or in English, Isaiah. However, about 700 years ago, Ibn Kathir wrote a book called The Stories of the Prophets, and Ibn Kathir lived around 1300 AD or 700 years after the Hijrah. In that book, he includes Isaiah as one of the prophets and tells his story. Now, Ibn Kathir was an expert on tafsir and faqih. He wrote several books, including a 14-volume set of books on the history of the world. Today, his books are quite well known and are available in various languages. So why did he include Ashiya, or Isaiah, in his book about the prophets? Well, it seems that much earlier, Ali al-Qasiyah He wrote around 120 years after the prophet, and he included Isaiah in his list of prophets. So this is much earlier than Ibn Kathir, and it's less well known, but he also wrote a book called Stories of the Prophets, and he included Shem and also Eliezer as prophets, two people known in the Bible but not included in the earlier lists. Al-Qasiyah, he is famous in Islam as he introduced one of 7 accepted methods of reciting the Quran. He's also the founder of the Kufi school of Arabic grammar. So, Isaiah is quite well known in Muslim educated circles, especially along with the literature, and he's known for his predictions of the coming of Jesus and some Muslims claim his predictions of the coming of Muhammad. Now, first, what about the archaeological proofs for Isaiah? The Bible tells us the story of Isaiah, that is in both the histories of the kings of Israel and also in the book of Isaiah. Muslim exegesis preserves the storyline somewhat parallel to the Bible, where it states that there was a king in Jerusalem known as Hezekiah. Remember him, he's important. Hezekiah heard and obeyed Isaiah's advice to try to turn the people from the growing influence of paganism and polytheism, and he couldn't stop them. So the Muslim tradition maintains that Hezekiah was a righteous man, but that things got worse and worse, and after he died they got even more worse. And so Isaiah, he told the people not to forsake God, and he warned them to cease from their persistent disobedience of God. Muslim tradition maintains that the unrighteous people in Israel, in their anger, sought to kill Isaiah, and in the end, Isaiah was martyred by being sawn in two. Now, in these last few years, a popular teaching has arisen among Western historians and archaeologists who claim that Isaiah was just a made-up story. They claim he probably didn't exist, and if he did, then his story isn't very accurate, and that if you examine it carefully, you will notice that there are different hands, it seems like, writing this story. So they come up with, there must be a bunch of different authors who authored and put together this thing at different times. However, those who support a more literal interpretation of the Bible counter that writing styles change over the years, so that what was written earlier would have been in a different style than what was written later. If you examine my own writings, you will find that some of the things I wrote 40 years ago are very different, both in content as well as in style, from what I write today. So I put very little stock in the theory that there were multiple writers of the book of Isaiah. I have an article on the website that deals with Isaiah. You can read it if you're interested. It's there on the screen. The second problem that many historians have is that Isaiah was a prophet and he made predictions about the future. And he predicted a king would come from Babylon whose name was Cyrus. According to the Bible, and accepted by traditional Muslim teaching, Isaiah clearly prophesied about this king, and he named him years before he was born. Now, this is just too much for some historians, especially those who are atheists or agnostics, or they insist that the story of Isaiah must be moved to a later date, so there's no miraculous prophecy. They insist that the writings of Isaiah must have been written at the time of Cyrus or afterwards. They deny the idea that such a specific prophecy being given and then coming true could actually happen. So there are lots of issues with the book of Isaiah, and when speaking with different scholars, all kinds of different issues come up. Now, for many years, it was easy to argue about the existence of Isaiah because there was little or no evidence of him, or evidence of the king, Hezekiah, or other people around him. And then things changed. One event was the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were these old manuscripts that had been hidden away in a cave up near the Dead Sea. Among them was a scroll of the book of Isaiah. It was almost complete apart from a few small damaged portions. It was carbon dated and found to be over 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew manuscripts that we had up to that time. It's about 1,000 years before Muhammad this scroll was written. Now, what's even more amazing is that it is very, very close to the book of Isaiah that we have today. Over the years, copiers have been very careful and very faithfully copying these ancient books. There's even evidence that the scrolls were carefully double-checked for errors to catch any scribal errors in the copying. Now, these Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to between 300 BC and 100 BC. Isaiah as a person is dated between 740 BC and 640 BC, using the life of Hezekiah as a guide. So the actual manuscripts we have come about 300 years after Isaiah lived. Now, do you remember in the last video, number 18 on David and Solomon? Dr. Mazur was digging in the royal ruins on Mount Jerusalem. She found a fascinating discovery. A bulla or seal was found bearing an impression depicting two winged sun discs flanked by in Egyptian Anik symbols, and it contained a Hebrew inscription that reads, "Belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah." This bulla was discovered along with 33 other seals inside of that 10th century BC old building. And so the name Hezekiah exists there, and it may have been one he personally held in his hands. So he existed as a person. Earlier, back in the 1830s, a clay object was found in Iraq with Akkadian writing on 6 sides. It contained the records of Sennacherib, the king of Nineveh, who attacked King Hezekiah. It describes the siege of Jerusalem during the time of King Hezekiah, and it names him, but it doesn't say anything about capturing Hezekiah. This is because in the biblical story, God destroys Sennacherib's army, and he returns home without taking the city. So this 6-sided record of Sennacherib and his reign, it brags of taking many cities and capturing many people. It names them, but it does not say that he captured Hezekiah. After he returned home, one of his sons, Esarhaddon, remember him, Esarhaddon, he rebelled, killed his father, and took over the throne. Now, about a couple meters away in 2009, archaeologists uncovered another seal. This one was broken, but archaeologists could make out the name. Yeshayahu in Hebrew. This is the name Isaiah in the Hebrew language. On the seal there were also 3 letters, NVY, Nevi, or in Arabic, Nebi. And this is the word prophet, and this is how it's written. Now, in Arabic, usually it has an aleph at the front, but in some cases it's written without the aleph. So there we have it saying Nebi Ashiya, and there it is. That's in Arabic, and it gives his name Yeshayahu on this seal, and it's there. Now, we don't know of anybody else with the name Isaiah who would have been in the palace back at that time who would have had a seal, and so it most likely is the seal of the prophet Isaiah, and because he was there in the palace very close to King Hezekiah. Then in 2017, that's just very recent, another archaeological discovery happened. In the ancient city of Nineveh, known as Mosul, in modern-day Iraq, there's a monument dedicated to the prophet Jonah. Centuries ago, this was a church, but it was transformed into a mosque. It's quite a large structure. It dominates that part of the city. This story has a strange twist. During the war with ISIS, or Daesh, the ISIS soldiers exploded and destroyed the tomb of Jonah in Mosul. And if you want to learn more, I've got some more things on Jonah in on the Sacred City website that talks about him and the orientation of that mosque. Then the ISIS fighters, they looted through the ruins looking for any gold or treasures. They were convinced there must be more, so they began to dig a series of tunnels under the ruins looking for ancient artifacts that they could plunder and sell for cash. No one knows what priceless things were taken and sold, but when the Iraqi army liberated the area, they discovered 4 tunnels, and in those tunnels, archaeologists uncovered 7 ancient inscriptions dating back to 2,700 years, back to an Assyrian king. You see, when the Iraqi army liberated the area from ISIS, they called in archaeologists who announced that while exploring the tunnels, they unexpectedly discovered the ruins of the Assyrian palace located under Jonah's tomb. In the palace, they discovered inscriptions which describe the rule of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, who reigned between 681 and 669 BC, and who's mentioned in the Bible in the story of Isaiah in 2 Kings, and also mentioned by name in the book of Isaiah. One of the inscriptions found in the tunnels about this king, it's translated this way: "The palace of Esarhaddon, strong king, king of the world, king of Assyria, governor of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the kings of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt and Cush." Now, why do I bring this up? I want to show you that the story of Isaiah fits into actual recorded history. There is archaeological proof that the events recorded in the book of Kings in the Bible and in the book of Isaiah did take place. You see, the stories of the prophets are not just made-up stories written much later. There's too much detail that is being confirmed today. As archaeologists dig deeper, more and more evidence turns up to support the history of the prophets. Now, 2 things before we end. First, note that Isaiah was a prophet to many people, not just one group of people. This is a small point, but it's an important point. Today there's a popular idea that's circulating amongst Muslims that different prophets came each to different people, but Muhammad came to the whole world. I've heard this many, many different times as I have talked to people. But when we examine the writings of the prophets, and Isaiah is a very good example, and we have the ancient scripts and we have the evidence, and we find in Isaiah that Isaiah is a prophet to many people. He prophesies and speaks to the Egyptians, and he warns them. He speaks to the Assyrians, and he warns them. He speaks to the Edomites and to the Moabites and to the Ammonites. He speaks to the Jews and to many other people. So it's not that each prophet came to just speak to a certain people All of the prophets came. It's more that the prophets came at different times. You need to have a concept of history. God is sending prophets at different times, and God has always had a small handful of people who speak out for him, even though the majority of people don't listen. Now, the last point in this book that we want to make about the prophecies of Isaiah is important to Muslims, to Jews, and to Christians. You see, Isaiah prophesies many things about the coming Messiah. The word Messiah means the anointed one. Anointing was done when oil is poured over the head of a special person, perhaps to make him a king or a ruler, or a special religious leader. Way back in Leviticus, the third book of Moses, God tells Moses to anoint Aaron with a special oil to make him the high priest, or the leading religious figure in the country. It was his job to intercede before God for the people, and so he was an anointed one. In the same way, the Jews have looked forward to someone coming, this anointed one, someone special who would lead their people into the truth. Now, the Jews do not look back to anyone who has come yet as being the Messiah or the anointed one. That's the big difference between the Jews and the Christians. The Christians look back to Jesus as being the anointed one, the Messiah, who not only came with a message, but who would fix things that went wrong in the Garden of Eden. He would be the one that all of the prophets spoke about, and would be the last of the prophets, indeed more than a prophet from God. Muslims, on the other hand, look to Muhammad as the last one of the prophets. And this is one of the big issues between Muslims and Christians. Christians say that Jesus was the last and final. Muslims say that Muhammad was the last and the final. Both of them include the book of Isaiah and the prophecies of Isaiah as being part of their evidence. So that is why this prophet is so important to us. Now, there are a number of different schools of thought when it comes to the prophet Isaiah. There are, of course, some who say that Isaiah is not important. The book was written later, maybe by several different people who tried to make their writings look like they were written earlier. And the people who claim these things, they're unbelievers, and they're usually not people of faith. Then there are Christians who accept the book of Isaiah and they embrace the prophecies. They understand that they are all pointing to Jesus, the Messiah. And there are hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, who believe this. And many Muslims support that Jesus is prophesied about in the book of Isaiah. That's why everyone should read it. But there are also Muslims who have come forward and said that they see prophecies of Muhammad in the book, as well as those of Jesus. So Isaiah is a place of theological conflict where the different faiths disagree. This is why it's an important book for us to study. Now, Bukhari has an interesting story. Amr bin al-As tells us that he believes Muhammad is mentioned in the Torah, and he claimed that the Torah said this of the Prophet Muhammad. O Prophet, we have sent you as a witness and a giver of glad tidings, as a warner, as a guardian of the illiterates. You are my slave and my messenger. I have named you Mutawakkil. You are neither discourteous or harsh or a noisemaker in the markets. You do not do evil and to those who do evil to you, but you deal with them with forgiveness and kindness. Allah will not let him die till he makes upright the crooked people by making them say, none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, with which will be opened the blind eyes, the deaf ears, and the enveloped hearts. Now, some Muslim teachers claim that from this hadith, that anyone who's familiar with the book of Isaiah should recognize it as coming from chapter 42 of Isaiah, and that it refers to Muhammad. And they argue that the Arabs of the 7th century, way down there in Mecca, would not have had access to the writings of Isaiah. And how could Muhammad so closely match what Isaiah wrote? They claim this is a proof for Muhammad, and it demonstrates that Isaiah predicted his coming. Now, the whole thing hinges on the argument that these Arabs are from way down there in Mecca in the desert and could not have known about the book of Isaiah or have heard it quoted. So how did something come around that is so close? However, I don't think it's very close, first, and second, this argument starts to fall apart when we place the story in Petra, not in Mecca. The story of Petra, if you go there, in that city, there are 4 churches there in the Christian sector. There were Christian tombs there, and there was friction between the Christians and the polytheists. So there's a very good chance that the people there would have heard about the book of the Prophecies of Isaiah, and they would have heard Christians arguing about Jesus and giving proofs for him from the book of Isaiah. In the very same way, they might have also wanted to use something from Isaiah to argue in favor of Muhammad. And so they chose chapter 42. Later, it seems like a miracle if you put the story way down and far off Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But to place the story in Petra, then the argument begins to fall apart. Now, why am I saying all this? Friends, this is a warning. Moving the location of Muhammad from Mecca up to Petra is not a simple thing. It will impact Muslim theology. Old arguments that stood under the Mecca version of the story will not stand necessarily under the Petra version of the story. If you have a chance, read the book of the Prophecies of Isaiah, or Ashiya in Arabic, and read the stories of him. Listen to his prophecies. He speaks to many different nations. Do you find Muhammad in the book of Isaiah, or do you find Jesus? Who do you think the prophet is speaking about? It's important to go back and look at the entire book and see who is he speaking about throughout the book. For instance, turn to Isaiah 11. He tells us that the one who is coming will be a descendant of Jesse. This is the name of David's father, King David's father. He is mentioned twice in the chapter 11. Look at chapter 7, verse 14 in Isaiah. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. The name Emmanuel means God with us. Isaiah is pointing to Jesus. You can read this all the way through the book, and there are lots of places, if you look in the internet, lots of different charts that show all the things that point to Jesus. Look at chapter 53. Who's the prophet speaking about? He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. He took up our infirmities. He carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. The prophet Isaiah goes on and he says, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has laid on him, that's this coming Messiah, the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before her shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and make him to suffer, for the Lord makes his life a guilt offering. This is all about Jesus. This is what Christians quote. These verses don't tell about Muhammad, rather they point to the coming Messiah. And they're famous. All Christians everywhere, they hear these verses. They're quoted over and over again in Christian circles. So in review, there is not a single mention of Isaiah in the Quran or in the Hadiths. At least not by name. And in the Christian scriptures, Isaiah is a very important prophet, as he clearly points to Jesus as the coming Messiah or the Anointed One, and it even calls him Emmanuel, God with us. That is a very A powerful statement. This is all in the book of Isaiah in the Bible. I say that not just because I'm a follower of Jesus, but because I have searched the writings of the prophets looking for the one that they predicted would come, and I found my answer in Jesus Christ. Where do you find your answer? I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.